Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Zane Richer and thank you so much for watching. Today's topic comes out of several conversations that I was actually able to have over the 4th of July holiday, over Independence Day, as I was celebrating and spending time with friends and family. For whatever reason, this one particular question kept coming up. It came up 3 or 4 times independently, and some of it was in relation to the last video we did, but mostly it just seemed like people were curious, and it was enough that I thought maybe this is something that's worth elaborating on a little bit. And people would come up to me and they'd say, Zane, you know, I really love this country. I care about this. I think this is a great country, and I'm really happy to live here. I really am. But as a Christian, as I consider our revolution, I'm not sure that I can justify that. I'm not sure I can sanction it. I'm not sure that that was okay. After all, the Bible does say that we're to be subject to those in authority over us. And what is a revolution if not the violent overthrow of the authorities over us? That is certainly not sanctioned in the Bible. And so as a Christian, I'm not sure I can justify that. And as people kept mentioning this to me, I was thinking, well, isn't this interesting? Because clearly we have people here that are intelligent, that are strong in their faith, strong enough and intelligent enough that they're willing to call into question the traditions of their own culture as in order to be biblically literate and biblically authentic. And that's certainly commendable. But here's the thing: we're not actually teaching our history anymore. If we were teaching our history, then people would understand what had happened. But right now we have this ridiculous idea in our heads that our revolution was fought because we got tired of paying taxes on our tea. If that was the case, of course it's not justifiable. If that's actually what happened, of course we have to condemn that as Christians. The question is that actually what happened? So today we're going to take up that topic, and we're going to ask ourselves, was the American Revolution legitimate from a biblical perspective? Was it justifiable? Was it all right? And the way we're going to do that is in this first part of the episode, which is what we're filming right now, which is what you're watching right now. We're going to look through the Bible, and we're going to talk about what it says about how Christians are supposed to relate to their government. It's called political theology. We're going to do a brief overview and try to build a framework for us to understand this topic in. And once we have that framework in mind, then we're going to go on, and in the next episode that we film, we're going to talk about, did the American experience match that? Did they actually uphold those principles from the Bible, or did they violate them? With the understanding that if they violated them, then as Christians, we have to condemn what we did in America. Whereas if they actually took great pains to uphold those principles, well, then they deserve our highest approbation. All right, so right now we're going to get into what does the Bible actually say about dealing with the civil government. All right, now as a disclaimer, I am not a preacher, but I'm going to do my best to walk through what the scripture has to say on this particular issue. The book of Romans, chapter 13. That's going to be where we're going to start today. The book of Romans, chapter 13, which begins like this. Paul says, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers," meaning government here, higher powers. "For there is no power but of God, and the powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the powers, resisteth the ordinances of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves judgment." All right. So that's what Paul's saying. This is the go-to chapter on this idea of how do we deal with government. What is the Christian's response to government? Paul says here, let every soul be subject. Let every soul be subject. Why? Because he goes on to say, the powers that be are ordained of God. The powers that be, the governmental apparatus which exists, is ordained of God. Because God really does care about this idea of authority. What does that mean? What does that look like? Why does God care about authority? Because it reflects who he is. It reflects his own character. It is the nature of God to possess and wield all authority. And as his image bearers on earth and his ambassador to the nations, we are in charge of executing that authority. And he cares very deeply how we go about doing that and how we interact with that, how we respond to it, because it reflects who he is. And he's very keen on keeping his name clean. So, that's what Paul's saying here. and this is part one of our understanding of what it means to be a Christian working with and under governments. We're to be subject to the authorities. Why? As if it was God himself, because he's the one that originated it, he's the one that instituted it, and we're to obey it as if it was unto him. Okay, so that's point one. But as any biblical scholar, or any Christian really will tell you, we never take Scripture in isolation. We have to understand it in light of the overall narrative. In other words, we have to understand it in context. That's good literary advice for any genre, but especially Scripture. Understand it in context. And right now, what we're going to do is we're going to pair that with another verse, which I think gives us a fuller understanding of this idea. Because if we're just reading this, we might come to the conclusion that anything the civil government says is actually, we actually have to obey. Regardless of whether it's wrong or not. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually take that and we're going to turn to our next verse we're going to talk about, which is Acts chapter 5. The book of Acts chapter 5, and we're going to start in verse 27. Now, so far in this story of Acts, what we've seen happen is that Christ has come to earth. Christ has lived among us. He's carried out his ministry. He's healed us, he's fed us, he's taught us, and he's gone to the cross for us. He's died, he's raised again, he's appeared and talked to Cephas and to the 12 and then to the brethren, and he's ascended into heaven. And he's left behind him his church, his people, under the instruction and the direction of Peter and the other apostles. And he's given them the commandment that you will go into all the nations of the earth, and you're going to preach my name. You're going to preach the gospel, what I've done for you. And that's exactly what the apostles and Peter are doing as we pick up this story in Acts chapter 5. They're preaching Christ. They're preaching Christ in their homes. They're preaching Christ in their cities, in the very temple of Jerusalem. And this greatly offended the powers that be at that point in time, whether the Romans or the Jews. It was extraordinarily offensive to them. And as a side note, I should say that you may be very, very sure that wheresoever Christ is preached, it will cause great offense amongst those who are perishing. And you say to me, Zane, why? Why does it cause so much offense? Because the whole message of the cross, the whole image of the cross, is one giant visual reminder of what we deserve. You and I, we deserve that cross. We deserve that judgment. We deserve that conviction. We deserve that death. You say to me, why do we deserve that? We deserve it because we are not good enough. When the standard is perfection, we are not good enough. We're not good enough. We're not smart enough. We're not strong enough. We're not kind enough. We're not humble enough. We're not enough. And because we're not enough, that cross is what we deserve. The good news is that God chose not to leave us there to our fate. He chose to come down himself to earth to take on the form of a human. And as we are being dragged away to our execution on that mountain, he stepped in front of us. He unbound our chains, and he put them on his own wrists, and he was dragged off in our place, and he died in our place. And he told us that anyone that believes in what he's done for them, that accepts his substitution on our behalf, will be saved. And this is the heart of the gospel. And this is what Peter and the rest of the apostles were preaching in Jerusalem. And we pick up the story in verse 27. And when they brought them, because the soldiers came, it was so offensive that the soldiers came and rounded them up. And when they brought them, they set them before the council. And the chief priest asked them, saying, Did we not straitly command you that ye should not teach in this name, being Jesus? And behold, ye have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine. And ye would bring this man's blood upon us. Then Peter and the apostles answered, okay, this is the important part. Peter and the apostles answered and said, we ought rather to obey God than men. Okay, that's the key verse. And these are the two halves of this story. You're to be subject to those in authority over you, but we have to obey God rather than man. So together, we put those together and we find that as Christians, we have an obligation to obey the government which is over us until the point where they command us to sin. At that point, we must prefer to obey God rather than man. So this is not an unlimited, this is not an absolute obedience to the authorities. This is contingent. Insofar as they do not tell us to do something which is wrong, we're to obey them. But the second they cross that line and mandate something which violates our conscience, whether they tell us to do something which we know is evil, or whether they demand that we abstain from doing something that is indispensable to right worship, we ought rather to obey God than man. So, this is the paradigm that we're going to be using as we come to try to understand what happened in the American Revolution. Did we, as colonists, and later as independent statesmen, did we violate the command to be subject to those in authority over us? If we did, then we must therefore decide that it is worth condemning as Christians. And pick up after this. If they did not, if they took great pains and great personal sacrifice to maintain that they followed biblical procedures, principles, and guidelines insofar as they were physically able, then they must deserve our highest respect and our vindication. All right, so next week we're going to talk about what actually happened, and we're going to compare it to this framework that we developed out here. Be subject to the authorities until they command us to sin. That is the Christian perspective on this. So make sure that you tune in and watch that episode when it comes out, and together we can try to answer this question of whether the American Revolution, from this framework that we have, is actually justifiable from a Christian perspective. As always, I'm very interested in your thoughts and your comments on this matter. Please feel free to let me know what you think and where you stand on this issue. I'd be happy to hear that and interact with you in that regard. All right. That's all that I've got for right now. Thank you, and God bless.